History as it happens, January 18th, 2022. The end of NATO.
Men with courage and vision can still determine their own destiny.
There will be new challenges for NATO as the level of concern about armed.
The past 4 months, we have seen some of the worst inhumanity in our lifetime. But we've also seen the bravery of our troops, the resolve.
Told President Putin directly that if Russia further invades Ukraine, the United States and our European allies would respond with strong economic measures.
Does NATO exist today to defend Western Europe? Against whom? To conduct humanitarian interventions? Where? As Russia threatens to invade Ukraine, NATO's post-Cold War eastward expansion could wind up entangling the U.S. and Europe in another war. Let's try to answer these questions by going back to the beginning, to 1949 with Andrew Bacevich. Next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The United States remains firmly committed to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of Russian aggression.
This pernicious concept of American exceptionalism, which most of our fellow citizens couldn't even define, but nonetheless, I think is an extraordinarily powerful phenomenon that finds us persuading ourselves that we are indeed the chosen people.
Two years after Truman announced his anti-communist doctrine before Congress,
one of the primary objectives of the foreign policy of the United States is the creation of conditions in which we and other nations will be able to work out a way of life free from coercion.
The United States joined 11 other nations, signing a treaty to make the military containment of communism possible.
On April 4th, 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed by Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Italy, Portugal, the United Kingdom, Iceland, Canada, and the United States. This union of 12 nations.
Men with courage and vision can still determine their own destiny. They can choose slavery or freedom, war or peace. I have no doubt which they will choose. The treaty we are signing here today is evidence of the path they will follow. If there is anything certain today, if there is anything inevitable in the future, it is the will of the people of the world for freedom and for peace.
April 4th, 1949, the birth of NATO. Greece and Turkey would join in 1952. The North Atlantic Treaty got its authority from Article 51 of the UN Charter, affirming the right of independent states to individual or collective defense. NATO's origins can also be found in the Korean War. As historian Ian Kershaw explains in his book, The Global Age, that war had significant consequences for Europe because of the dramatic increase in U.S. defense spending. The Soviets' first test of an atomic bomb in 1949 also helped. U.S. military aid to Europe reached almost $5 billion by the end of 1951, and soon 80% of American aid to Western Europe was for military rather than civilian purposes. Now, after the Cold War ended with the breakup of the Soviet Union and revolutions in the former Eastern Bloc, the end of the Warsaw Pact, some European leaders, such as Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, wanted NATO out. He saw no need for any military alliances, east or west. But a world leader on the other side of the Atlantic saw things differently, and his vote mattered more.
Today, Europe is enjoying a period of unparalleled prosperity and an uninterrupted peace, longer than it is known in the modern age, and NATO has made the difference.
President George Bush in 1989, about to make his first trip to Europe as president. And at this point, the Soviet Union was still around, but the Cold War had thawed considerably. And he knew that without NATO's raison d'etre, pardon my French, there would be questions about the alliance's future. In other words, NATO had served its purpose. Time to move on. Well, the president did not want Europe to believe it could do without the U.S. security umbrella, even though the Cold War was coming to an end.
And the alliance will prove every bit as important to American and European security in the decade ahead. The importance of the alliance and its democratic underpinnings is the message I now take to Europe. NATO has been a success by any measure. But success breeds its own challenges.
A few years later, with Bush in retirement and Bill Clinton in the White House, a cauldron of ethnic hatred and territorial conflict pulled NATO into its first major post-Cold War mission to stem the bleeding in the former Yugoslavia. A NATO peacekeeping force of 60,000 troops was deployed to Bosnia-Herzegovina after the signing of the Dayton Accords in 1995. Then NATO took offensive, or what you might call humanitarian interventionist military action, to stop the Serbian campaign of ethnic cleansing against Kosovo's Albanian majority. A bombing campaign lasted 11 weeks.
To achieve our aims as an alliance, 19 democratic nations with 780 million people working together in the first sustained military operation in NATO's history.
As I mentioned, that war convinced the Western alliance that it must protect the human rights of those whose lives are under attack by despotic regimes. And it explains why NATO intervened in Libya in 2011 and why there were NATO forces in Afghanistan, and why NATO might wind up defending the sovereignty of Ukraine. Now, as I speak into this microphone in mid-January, it is unclear if Vladimir Putin is going to order Russian forces to invade his neighbor, with the potential aim of annexing pro-Russian parts of eastern Ukraine.
And that
is Putin at a news conference late last year. He said Russia follows a peaceful foreign policy, but it has the right to ensure its safety. We cannot be but concerned by the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO. So not for the first time in diplomatic history, each side sees the other's moves as aggressive, even though each side says, hey, we're just defending ourselves. The questions we're concerned with here are how did the U.S. and by extension NATO become the de facto guarantor of Ukraine's territorial integrity? What is NATO's mission? Should NATO exist any longer? Andrew Bacevich is Professor Emeritus of History at Boston University and now the president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington. And he is the author of many books on international relations, most recently, After the Apocalypse, America's Role in a World Transformed. Andrew Bacevich, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me on.
So when I was preparing for this, I read an op-ed written in the New York Times in 2013. I'm going to read a couple of sentences and see if you recognize who might have written this. The devolution of NATO into a European alliance should occur in phases, but the place to begin is with this basic proposition. In 2023, the United States will withdraw from the alliance. That'll give Europe an entire decade to figure out how to defend itself from the nearly non-existent threats that it faces, and to get used to the fact that the Cold War has, in fact, ended. Somehow or other, I think they'll be able to manage. Who wrote that?
Is that me?
Yes. A decade ago, and well, here we are. The United States did not withdraw from NATO. I think we're seeing now in the news this question raised. What is NATO's role and what is the U.S. role in NATO as Russia threatens to potentially invade Ukraine, which is not a NATO country, but has been cooperating with the alliance for the past decade or more?
Well, I think I'll make only one small revision to that quote that you read, and that is in my description of the Russian threat. If back then I called it non-existent, I think today I would call it minor and wildly exaggerated. But I still think that the larger interests of the United States would be served if we allowed NATO to become a European alliance rather than one in which the assumption is that the United States must play a leading role.
Could there be a NATO without the United States? I mean, do European nations want to continue with this without the U.S. security umbrella?
Oh, I doubt it. If you told me that you would ensure the well-being of myself and my family in perpetuity, then I think I probably would be not particularly inclined to work, to exert myself. Why should I? You're going to do that for me. And I think that describes the relationship between the United States and the European members of the alliance today. Now, it is important, critically important to emphasize how conditions today differ from the conditions that existed in 1949 when the alliance was founded. I remember those conditions vividly. I was 2 years old. Well, I don't remember them at all, but I know that in 1949, Western Europe, non-communist Europe, was flat on its ass. The nations of that part of Europe, to include the new Federal Republic of Germany or West Germany, had been horribly damaged over the course of World War II. The populations had been battered, were demoralized. Economies were in a shambles. And I think arguably, more than anything else, Europe had been psychologically damaged. Europe was the center of the world. And here we are after World War II, and the place is a mess, and they need help. And it is a great tribute to the United States and to U.S. leaders in those days, Harry Truman, Dean Acheson, George C. Marshall, George Kennan. It is to their everlasting credit that they came to the aid of Europe, and not simply because we felt sorry for Europeans, but because we recognized that it was in our interest to do so. That's the rationale for founding NATO in the first place. It's the rationale for the Marshall Plan. It's the rationale for stationing U.S. troops in Europe. And it all made sense in the context of 1949. Well, guess what? None of those conditions exist today. I haven't visited Europe in a while because of COVID, but when I have visited, what I see is a continent that is prosperous, largely democratic. We can point to, let's say, Poland and Hungary as blots on that score, and frankly, more than able to manage its own security concerns.
And peaceful for the better part of the past half century or more.
Good point, because back in 1949, when people in 1949 looked at the recent past, it seemed like every 10, 15, or 20 years, Germany and France would go at it. And so there was a legitimate concern, I think. But in 2022, not a chance. And I think the other thing I would say, and this is looking at it from the point of view of U.S. interests, well, in 1949, when the alliance was founded, we were riding high, no question about it, relative to the rest of the world, in large part because we had escaped World War II with virtually no damage whatsoever. We had become richer as a consequence of the worst war in all of history. And salvaging Europe was a principal priority of U.S. grand strategy. Well, guess what? Today, we got other priorities. We should be spending our money in other places.
I should say that Europe has been peaceful for the better part of a half century or more, with the notable exception of the fall of Yugoslavia. We'll circle back to that situation in a little bit. To NATO's origins, as you just described. After World War II, the U.S. began to think of aid to Europe, especially in the early 1950s, increasingly in military terms as the Marshall Plan wound down. To what extent can that be traced to the outbreak of the Korean War and the resulting increase in U.S. defense spending?
The outbreak of the Korean War prompted the full-scale rearmament of the United States military. We have forgotten that in the period from the end of World War II, September 1945, and the summer of 1950, when the Korean War begins, U.S. military spending was at a very low level. The chiefs of staff were complaining publicly and privately that the Truman administration was starving the military. In the spring of 1950, under the guidance of Paul Nitze, now forgotten.
Cold Warrior.
Cold Warrior par excellence. The Truman administration approved a document called NSC 68 that identified the Soviet Union as an existential threat and called for the comprehensive rearmament of the United States to deal with that threat. Truman wouldn't have anything to do with that until the start of the Korean War in June of 1950. And then he approved NSC 68. And that then led to very large increases in U.S. defense spending, really led to the creation of the military-industrial complex. From that point onward, there was really no looking back. There was no serious proposal to reduce the scope of the American military to what it was before 1950. All that's been forgotten. But that was the turning point.
NATO was envisioned as being a defensive alliance to protect Western Europe against potential Soviet aggression, although two countries on the eastern side of the continent, Turkey and Greece, were included in NATO. The USSR, however, viewed NATO, as Russia does today, as an aggressive alliance. The USSR responded by creating the Warsaw Pact in 1955. So I guess history is rhyming there. But NATO was never supposed to be an expansive or interventionist military alliance, right?
Well, from our point of view, no. When adversaries face one another and try to ascertain the intentions of the other guy, I think there's a tendency to assume, to look for antagonistic behavior and threat. So it's certainly the case that from the point of view of the United States and its NATO allies, well, of course, we had no intention whatsoever of starting a war with the Soviet Union. It didn't necessarily look that way to the Soviets. And then, of course, you have to factor in bureaucratic politics. It's in the interest of military bureaucracies to emphasize the potentially aggressive behavior of the other side. I mean, I think that from our present point of view in 2022, it's very difficult to build a case that the Soviets ever seriously intended to invade Western Europe.
And if they wanted to, they could have. They had numerical superiority, except for the nuclear umbrella.
Agree with you on that.
Okay, go ahead.
I don't agree with you on that. Yes, they had numerical superiority, no question about it. I think there's no question about it. We always had nuclear superiority, although by the early 1950s, the Soviets also had at least some kind of a nuclear capability. How many nukes detonating in Western Europe would constitute a catastrophe? The answer is one.
Yes.
So in my judgment, they never really were looking for the opportunity to attack. They certainly were posturing a serious military capability, probably from their point of view, to deter us. And also, again, emphasizing the bureaucratic politics, creating a posture where the demands of the Red Army for more money, more weapons, more people had some justification, just as on our side, militaries or national security elites were making a similar argument.
As they said at the end of Dr. Strangelove, we must not allow a mine shaft gap.
Supposing the Ruskies stashed away some big bombs, see, and we didn't. When they come out in 100 years, they could take over.
I agree, Mr. President. In fact, they might even try an immediate sneak attack so they could take over our mine shaft space.
To your point, I agree. I don't think there's ever been convincing evidence that Stalin and then his successors wanted to invade Western Europe to spread, Soviet communism over the whole continent. And you're right. If they wanted to and if they had tried to invade, the nuclear umbrella of the West, of course, was a major deterrent to that. Let's skip ahead now to the end of the Cold War. If there was a moment or a time where there might have been a reordering of the post-World War II, post-Cold War world, this was it. You had leaders like Václav Havel of Czechoslovakia, the new leader. He wanted NATO out of Europe. He wanted all military alliances out of Europe. But President Bush did not want that to happen in the name of stability.
Well, I don't think President Bush's views and those of other, members of the foreign policy elite in that regard are all surprising. I mean, from their perspective, the Cold War ended in a great victory for the United States and the West. I think it's like a law of politics. When you think things are going your way, you exploit the advantage that presents itself. And I think that's probably what was really going on. By the end of the Cold War, NATO had come to be the preeminent symbol of the U.S. claim to leadership in Europe. And just because the Cold War ended, the United States had no interest in forfeiting its claim to leadership in Europe. And ergo, stick with NATO, preserve NATO, continue to maintain the U.S. military commitment to European security, even though at this point, there is no threat whatsoever. That is to say, once the Soviet Union collapses, the Warsaw Pact goes away, there is zero threat to the security of Western Europe. In some respects, the subsequent actions of expanding NATO and expanding the European Union eastward helped to create, at least in the Kremlin's eyes, the impression of a threat. And of course, they then exploit that impression of a threat. I don't think there was a threat there either, but the Russians exploit the impression of a threat to embark upon a course that brings us to where we are today.
Yeah, you must be reading my mind, because my next question was going to be, what was Russia's understanding of what NATO's post-Cold War role would be? Gorbachev certainly had his ideas, but he exited the scene shortly after that. We know that George H.W. Bush, his watchword was stability. He didn't want Europe to believe it could do without the United States, but he was also worried about stability or security vacuums. After the Cold War, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which were under Soviet domination, they wanted to join Western Europe and NATO as an insurance policy against potential for future Russian aggression. Obviously, Russia did not approve of that. They were against, were they not, the extension of NATO's reach to the east, right from the beginning?
Absolutely. And let's face it, my paternal grandparents came from Lithuania. By God, good news for Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia to regain independence and then to find sanctuary, security in NATO and the EU. From the perspective of the Baltic republics, who can regret that? Who can criticize that? On the other hand, from Vladimir Putin's perspective, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania were the equivalent of Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire. So when they depart the USSR and then become part of this anti-Soviet alliance. I mean, let's face it, NATO was an anti-Soviet alliance. He's going to take umbrage. I don't see how he could not. I don't see how any Russian leader could possibly look at the expansion of NATO in the aftermath of Cold War and sort of shrug it off as something of no particular interest to Russia or of no concern to Russian security.
Minor digression. Bacevich is a Lithuanian name.
Yeah, well, it was Bacevich's. And when my grandparents came to the United States and settled in Northwest Indiana, sometime around World War I don't think we even know exactly, for reasons unknown, my grandfather changed the suffix. So it was Vicius became Vich.
Thank you for indulging that digression. I always wondered. So you've written about the following quite a bit, how NATO's mission morphed into interventionist or humanitarian interventionism. I want to ask you about the fall of Yugoslavia and what that might teach us about what's going on right now, because Europe's first big post-Cold War challenge, security-wise, was the disintegration of Yugoslavia and the resulting chaos and bloodbath. NATO supporters would say the peacekeeping missions that followed years of war proved durable, that it worked.
In the past 4 months, we have seen some of the worst inhumanity in our lifetime. But we've also seen the bravery of our troops, the resolve of our democracy, the decency of our people, and the courage and determination of the people of Kosovo. We now have a moment of hope, thanks to all those qualities. And we have to finish the job and build the peace.
Well, I think the claim that it worked is an exaggeration. I think it's fair to say the interventions by NATO with the United States in the vanguard, did help bring an end to what was an exceedingly ugly set of civil wars. But I mean, if you've been reading the papers lately, there's still considerable instability and animosity, ethnically related animosity for example, in Bosnia. So it could well be, I don't know, it could well be that we haven't sort of seen the end of that ugly chapter in European politics.
Of course, the intervention was very messy. We were dropping bombs on the former Yugoslavia, Kosovo. There was a lot of displacement. So it certainly was not a clean ending to that.
Well, and it was an embarrassing moment for Europe. There was a brief period of time when, I don't remember who was the official, but declared with regard to the breakup of Yugoslavia, this is the hour of Europe, meaning this is when Europe will demonstrate its ability to manage these internal problems related to European security. They failed, no question about it. The response to the failure was for the United States to engineer a NATO intervention. Remember at the time there was, because there were questions about what's the role of NATO. post-Cold War. And the phrase that had become commonly used was either NATO needed to go out of area or was going to go out of business. This gets us back to bureaucratic politics, I think. This now well-established alliance providing lots of jobs in Brussels or in Mons. Last thing they wanted to do was go out of business. So they needed to go find things to do. The Balkans provided the first. This gets us off our topic, but the other one that's even more significant is when NATO decided they needed to involve itself in Afghanistan
and Libya
after 9/11, and Libya.
And those are not
so
in Europe.
We got a lot of out of area activity. Not clear to me that the result was to improve the cohesion and capability of the alliance itself with regard to its primary founding mission, which was to provide for the security of Europe itself.
The problem with comparing the Yugoslavia chapter or the Baltic states to what's going on now between Russia and Ukraine and whether NATO has a role there is that each of these situations is different. They each have their own histories, and the relationship between Russia and Ukraine is much different than, say, the relationship between, historically, the Soviet Union and Estonia, for instance.
Yes.
So here we are on the brink of a potential shooting war in the eastern part of Ukraine, although no one's quite sure whether the Russians really want to invade. Do you have a point of view on that?
Well, I don't pretend to be able to read Putin's mind, but I do think he's a rational actor. In some way, I dare say he wishes well for the country that he's responsible for leading. And I would think at the end of the day, the risk of doing great damage to Russian interests by invading Ukraine would dissuade him from doing that. That doesn't, by the way, eliminate the possibility of an accidental war. But I think it would not happen as a result of sort of a decision where he sits around the table and looks at his senior general and says, go. I don't think it's going to happen.
Ukraine-NATO cooperation really picked up last decade. I believe it was in 2008 an agreement was signed for cooperation, but the idea had been around, of course, since the end of the Cold War. But it really picked up after the Russian invasion of Crimea, the annexation of Crimea. The pro-Western government in Kyiv, as we now call it, wants to join NATO, apparently. So is it too late for NATO to say, well, maybe this isn't such a good idea after all?
Well, I think that's what they need to say. They need to find a way to say that without appearing to cave, be too obvious about caving, just as Russia needs to find a way to back away without seeming to give in to NATO. One of my colleagues at the Quincy Institute has recently written that the answer is neutralization. And he drew a comparison with the position of Austria during the Cold War. We've long forgotten. After World War II, Austria was not unlike Germany, was occupied by the victorious powers. And yet the United States and Great Britain and the Soviet Union found a way to categorize Austria as a neutral power, not on either NATO's side or the Warsaw Pact's side. That enabled all participants to back away from the possibility of conflict that would have been triggered by some disagreement in Austria. And my colleague, Anatol Lieven, says that provides a model for probably what we ought to be trying to do in Ukraine. I find that persuasive.
And Anatol was on the podcast a few weeks ago. That episode is titled Putin's Gamble, if anyone wants to listen to it. There's something else at work here, Andrew Bacevich, and that is the Biden administration, really any American administration, except for possibly the Trump administration, hanging on to the notion that the United States is the indispensable country, holding on to the idea of a world order that really doesn't exist anymore. Our influence, our hegemony is waning, and it seems like that's playing a role here. We just can't let things be. And I'm not saying I want to see a war in eastern Ukraine, because that could have calamitous consequences. We often know that wars can spill over into other countries. But it seems that our nation is having trouble just letting go.
You're absolutely right. This pernicious concept of American exceptionalism, which most of our fellow citizens couldn't even define, but nonetheless, I think is an extraordinarily powerful phenomenon that finds us persuading ourselves that we are indeed the chosen people, that we have this indispensable role that we must play because nobody else is capable. The world is not capable, absent American leadership, of somehow surviving. This is all very dangerous. And I think you're exactly right. Even if the circumstances that existed, let's say, in 1949, when NATO was created, even if the circumstances then might have seemed to lead to an evaluation of our role as indispensable, I think it's impossible in the present day to see that. So we need to give up this obsolete way of thinking. And that is proving to be very, very difficult. You know, maybe it's easy for me living in Walpole, Massachusetts, but the people who work in the Pentagon, you know, the people who work in the State Department, the people who work on the Hill, the people who work in the White House, I think have an especially difficult time of coming to terms with the fact that history has moved along, and therefore our role, which will continue to be an important role, just is not going to be what it was back 50, 60, 70 years ago.
And the question is, does the United States have to be the guarantor of the security of any democratic sovereign nation anywhere in the world? Ukraine, Taiwan, at some point you have too many. To what extent can we even fulfill our own security commitments abroad?
Well, to what extent are the American people willing to fight and die for some of those places?
For the Donbass region in Ukraine? Probably not.
Exactly. Yeah. So again, one would not want to oversimplify here, but by and large, during the Cold War, the American people were willing to fight and die for the security of Western Europe. After the Korean War began, they were willing to fight and die for the survival of South Korea. They were willing to fight and die for a period of time to ensure the survival of the Republic of Vietnam, but we changed our minds, understandably so. Today, with our so-called volunteer army, today, what are the places on earth that the American people are willing to fight and die for? To sustain large-scale loss. I mean, I think the outcome of the so-called global war on terrorism, primarily fought two wars of choice, Afghanistan and Iraq, those suggest that we actually have a very limited appetite for fighting and dying for faraway places. That, I think, ought to inform our thinking about the policies related, U.S. policies related to places like Ukraine or Taiwan.
Andrew Bacevich, as always, an honor to have you on the podcast, and you're welcome back anytime. So the title of this episode, The End of NATO. I don't necessarily mean the end as in it's over. I mean, what are NATO's ends? We know the means at its disposal, military force. But to what end? It's not a rhetorical question, not in an age of forever war and military budgets exceeding $700 billion. On the next episode of History as It Happens, some historians believe American democracy is coming apart at the seams, and the legitimacy of the 2024 election is hanging by a thread.
If you count the legal votes, I easily win. If you count the illegal votes, they can try to steal the election from us.
The fall of German democracy a century ago, the end of the Weimar Republic, might have something to teach us about our current moment. That's next when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.